I welcome you all to the module 4 of this course. So, the module 4 is about the concept of learning, and this is overall lecture number 8, which is titled as Classical Conditioning, Principles, Processes and Applications, and this is the first lecture of this module, that is module number 4. So, before we talk about today's lecture, let me give you a brief recap of the last lecture. So, the last lecture was part of the earlier module, which was about perception, sensation and perception. So, in the last lecture, which was lecture number 7, we discussed the concept of depth perception, and we tried to understand what is the different mechanisms through which our mind and the physiological apparatus or the sense organs perceives depths or the depth and distances. Using the concept of monocular and binocular cues, we also discuss the concept of motion perception, and we try to understand how we perceive motion in the world around us, and at the end we discussed the concept of perceptual set, which is a top down process, that when our beliefs, our expectations, whatever knowledge structure we have, how that influences what we perceive in the world. So, that those concepts we have discussed in the last lecture. So, in today's lecture, what we will be focusing on, since this is the part of new module, which is the concept which primarily focuses on the concept of learning. So, we will discuss in today's lecture what is the concept of learning and the different other kinds of concepts which are associated with the concept of learning. So, we will talk about types of learning, and primarily we will focus on one specific type of learning, which is called as classical conditioning, and we will talk about the different processes involved in it, and at the end we will talk about some real life applications of the concept of classical conditioning, particularly in the concept of behavior therapy and some other concepts. So, let us start today's lecture. Now, when we talk about learning, so we need to understand that animals and including humans, whenever there is an environmental stimulus in front of us, we respond to those environments, and accordingly we modify our behavior whatever is the requirement of the environment. So, how we respond to those environment can be categorized broadly into 3 types or 3 categories. One is called as reflexes, another is called instincts, and the third one is called learned behavior, which will be the focus of basically our this module, how we learn behaviors. Okay? But with learning, we also need to understand how it is different from the concept of reflexes, concept of instincts. So, these are the 3 ways: instincts, reflexes and learned behaviors are the 3 ways by which we respond to the environment, and accordingly we adapt. So, let us see what are these 3. The first one is called reflexes. So, reflexes means what? These are very simple, automatic, involuntary responses to specific stimuli. So, there are some kind of inbuilt mechanisms within our system or our body, which are very automatic, simple responses. So, when a stimulus comes, response happens automatically. So, those can be called as a reflexes. You do not have to think about them, automatically it happens, because these are programmed in our biological system. So, they occur without conscious thought and are usually controlled by the spinal cord or lower brain centers, which basically controls a lot of these functions which are automatic. So, in reflexes, what are the key features? Most of these reflexes are innate, means they are present at birth. So, like these are programmed in the physiology of the body. These are very fast and automatic, you do not have to think about them. Stimulus comes and you respond. This can be also stereotyped, the same responses every time. Every time the stimulus comes, the response is almost same. They are protective in nature, they are programmed in such a way that they help us to protect from some dangers from the environment. For example, some of the examples of reflexes in our life: pulling your hand away from hot stove. Whenever accidentally if your hand goes towards the fire, it automatically you simply pull it back. You do not have to think about it, the body responds automatically. The moment it goes near hot or fire, any kind of hot substance or fire, we automatically pull our hand or any part of the body that is close to the fire, and you do not have to think about it, the body automatically responds to it. So, this is an example of reflexes. Another example, blinking when something approaches your eyes. Whenever something approaches your eyes, you automatically blink. This is another reflex. we do not have to think about it, body automatically responds, eyes will automatically get closed. One of the most popular example of reflex is knee jerk response during a medical test. So, this is just in a animation it is shown. The moment you touch here on the knee, a little bit of pressure you give it, automatically the leg moves. So, this is called knee jerk movement. So, body does it automatically, you do not have to think about it and you do not have to respond it consciously. These are automatic response system. So, these are very simple responses which help us to protect. For example, whenever heat comes near to your body, you just automatically pull it away. So, this helps you to protect your body. So, these are simple responses which are called reflexes. These are automatic, inbuilt in our system, mostly presented from the birth itself. Okay? So, these are very important in a sense of for the survival, help in immediate survival, avoid injury, require no learning or decision making from the most basic level of behavior. So, these are most basic level of behavior that are programmed in our biological system. So, these are examples of reflexes. So, sometimes we respond to environmental stimuli using reflexes. The second kind of response that we do in response to environmental stimuli, these are called instincts. Now, instincts are also inborn pattern or behavior that are more complex than reflexes. These are also very similar to reflexes, but they are more complex. Reflexes are very simple responses, but instincts are also kind of certain inborn patterns of behavior, but then they are more complex than reflexes. So, they are only different in terms of complexity. So, they are triggered by certain stimuli. These are also called fixed action patterns. So, certain action patterns are stimulated by the environmental stimuli and they automatically unfolds according to the instincts. They are often goal directed and involve sequence of action. So, in reflex this is just one action, instinct may involve sequence of actions. So, that is how it is different in terms of complexity. So, key features includes these are also innate, but more complex than reflexes. These are universal within a species, generally if it is present in one species, generally it will be present in other members of the same species. These are triggered by specific stimuli which are also called as releasers. So, certain stimuli triggers them and then there is a sequence of behavior starts. They often involve fixed action patterns. So, there are the unfoldment of the instinctive behavior are very same, in the same way it will unfold in a fixed sequence. What are the examples of instincts? For example, infant sucking for nourishment. No one teaches an infant how to suck for milk and so on. It is present at birth, but then it is little bit more than just reflexes, it is little bit more complex behavior. Birds building nests, no one teaches a bird how to build a nest. This is instinctive present in the every member of the species. They know automatically how to build a nest, no one teaches them. So, this automatically unfolds, but it is much more complex than just reflex, because this behavior may include lot of actions, lot of sequential actions and it can be much more complex than just reflexive behavior. Humans show fight or flight response. Whenever there is a danger, they either try to fight or they try to run away just to protect themselves. So, this can be also example of instinctive behavior. Another example is animals migrating to other places seasonally. They simply know where to go. Thousands of kilometers they may just travel. No one tells them where is the direction. They do not know map and so on, but still they end up going to the right place. So, somehow it is within their system, they know that. So, these are very instinctive and it is present in all the members of the same species. So, these are all examples of instincts. They can be inborn patterns of behavior, but then again these are much more complex than reflexes. So, again there are a lot of psychological importance to the instincts. It aids in survival and reproduction, provide pre-programmed behaviors, bridge the gap between reflexes and learning. So, these are like intermediate actions between reflexes and the next concept that we will talk about, learning, which is the main focus of this one. So, this is another way species respond or animals respond to environmental stimuli. One is reflex, second is instincts. The third is learned behavior. So, many behavior which we need to learn, it is not inborn. Reflexes and instincts are inborn, you do not have to learn them, it is already there within your system from the birth itself, or it unfolds as the appropriate age comes up. Now, these two categories are inborn categories. We do not have to learn anything specifically for them, but the third category called learned behavior. So, lot of behaviors we have to learn with the interaction with the environment. They are not present at birth. The animals or the humans have to learn by interacting with the environment. So many things we learn which are not there when we at present, or they are not programmed in our system. So, those are all things that we acquire are called learned behaviors. So, psychologists define learning as a relatively permanent change in a person's knowledge or behavior that results from experience. So, any kind of relatively permanent change. So, some kind of change happens within you in terms of your actions or in terms of your knowledge system as a result of experience or interaction with the environment. So, we interact, we experience so many things, as a result we learn so many changes happens within us. And if those changes are relatively permanent, not just something as an experience, some changes happens which is very temporary, I cannot say that is learning. It is very temporary. So, it has to be little bit relatively permanent, it has to be like imprinted in our system little bit for a longer period of time, then we can call something as learning. So, these are like another way of saying it, this is a relatively permanent change in behavior or capacity for behavior due to experience. So, it is the same thing. So, your relatively permanent change in behavior or actions or in your knowledge structure, certain changes will happen, you learn something new. So, there is a change in your knowledge system, and how this happens? It is through experience. So, if you see this definition, there are three important elements that distinguish learning from other types of changes like reflexes and instincts. How learning is different from other type of changes that we discussed like reflexes and instincts? One is that it creates lasting change, not something that disappears after minutes or hours. So, if something you learn and then then after 1 hour or after a few minutes you forget about it, then we cannot call it as a true learning. So, learning has to be relatively permanent change, it has to be long lasting and so on, whatever change happens. What changes is either the knowledge stored in the memory or the actual behavior. So, learning may include both the aspects, that some changes happens in your behavior system, how you act in the environment, or it could be not directly shown in the action, but there can be some changes in the knowledge system or the information system that you have in your brain. Third system is the source of the change is experience or the interaction with the environment. How this change happens? It is, what is the source of this change? It is the experience. When we interact with the environment, the experience that we get out of interaction, that is the source of this change, not the temporary states like fatigue, motivation, drugs or physical condition. No. Through experience, interaction with the environment, certain changes happens which are relatively permanent, and these changes happens particularly in the actions or in the knowledge system, then we call it as a learning behavior. So, these are learned. So, all animals and particularly human beings, we learn a lot of things after the birth. Very few things are instinctive and reflexive. In human life, if you look at it, most of the things that we learn, that we acquire are as a result of learning. They are not present at birth. With the interaction of the environment, we learn lot of things, lot of new things, we acquire lot of new knowledge, new skills and so on, all these are learned processes. So, this is the meaning of learning when we talk about learning in the context of psychology. Now, there is another concept which many times people confuse with, or they find it difficult to distinguish, is called maturation. Now, learning is different from maturation. What is the difference? Maturation refers to the natural biological growth process that occurs in all living organisms over time. Maturation is not influenced by experience or practice, but it is driven by genetic factors. Now, maturation is a process. Many times lot of new changes happens within all of us, including animals, is that certain changes automatically happens as a result of developmental processes. So, as the child grows, certain development happens in the body mind structure. So, they become capable of learning something new. Before that development, they cannot learn that, So, that is natural automatic process of becoming capable of learning something, or some changes that happens because of developmental process, again which is, it is mostly genetic process. You do not have conscious involvement in it. So, these are called maturation. Developmental stages automatically comes up and lot of new changes happens in the organisms or animals, whatever it is. So, those are called maturational processes. See, changes happens, but not because of experience, but because of developmental changes. The key difference between learning and maturation is that learning is an acquired skill. In the learning, we learn something by interaction with the environment, but in maturation is a natural progression. Automatically body grows and goes into different developmental stages. A child, an infant becomes child becomes adolescence. So, these are all automatically changes. So, in every stages certain changes happens in their body mind structure, some new changes happen. So, these are all called maturational processes. It is a natural progression. It is not because of their experience. So, learning builds upon maturation. So, maturation provides the necessary foundation to learn something new, and so both are kind of dependent on each other. Certain learning can happen only when certain maturation happens. Before that you cannot learn. For example, a child cannot learn to talk before certain age group, because once that maturation process happens in the brain and their vocal cords, then only they can learn to speak. So, lot of learning can happen only when it is supported by the maturation process. So, you can have matured in certain areas like physical development, but still need to learn other aspects like social skills and cognitive skills. So, maturation provides certain foundation, but then you have to learn lot of things. So, most of the times they are kind of interaction between learning and maturation. So, learning and maturations are not opposites, they work together, as I already said. When people's biological component, brain and body are properly developed at certain stages, then only certain types of learning can happen. As I said, for example, to learning to speak a language, a child at certain age only, a child begins to talk and speak language, because our brains have matured to a level where they can recognize and imitate human speech. Not before that. Just after birth, a child cannot speak, simply because the brain and the body is not mature enough to imitate the speech. Only after certain stage, 2-3 years after certain maturation happens and child starts to imitate speech. So, both kind of interact with each other, but then again speech, so you have to learn lot of things around speech. Maturation gives you only capability, but you have to learn the speech processes from the interaction and the experience. So, now let us go into the learning process in more detail, because that is what we are focusing in this module, the process of learning, the types of learning and so on. So, when we talk about learning, how do we learn things? So, there are 3 ways we can learn things from our environment. Okay? So, there are 3 types or 3 categories of learning. One is called as an associative learning, another is called as a non-associative learning, and the third is called observational learning. So, all kinds of learning that we learn or acquire in our life could be one of these 3. Because of one of these 3, we learn, all the learnings can be categorized under these 3 categories. In many situations, all these multiple forms of learning may occur at the same time. There can be situations where we use all these 3 categories simultaneously or sequentially, depending on the situation. So, let us look into each of these in detail. The first one is called associative learning. Associative learning, as the name suggests, so there has people learn or an animal learn to associate 2 things. So, associative learning occurs when an individual forms a connection between 2 stimuli or between behavior and its consequences. Whenever there is a learning of association, this with this, if this comes, this will come. If we learn certain kinds of relationship or patterns of association, many times lot of learning is learning association. If this comes, this will also come. So, something like this. So, all kinds of associative learning are kind of between 2 things, association between, connection between 2 things, 2 stimuli, or lot of learning is also happens that we learn to associate our behavior with consequence. So, if I do this, what is the consequence? According to consequence, either I try to do this more or try to avoid this in the future. So, lot of learnings are associative learning with the idea that there is some kind of, we learn connection between 2 things. So, those are called associative learning. Now, two important types of associative learning we talk about. There are two broad categories of associative learning. One is called as classical conditioning and another is called as an operant conditioning. So, today's lecture will dedicate on classical conditioning, the next lecture will be dedicated on operant conditioning, and after that we will talk about observational learning. So, in classical conditioning, anyway we will be focusing more on specifically on this concept in today's lecture, but in nutshell, classical conditioning, we associate pairs of stimuli that occur sequentially in time. Whenever two things happens sequentially in time, one after the other, we learn that if this comes, that will also come. So, we will talk about this in detail in today's lecture. So, that is called classical conditioning. This is an associative learning because association between two stimuli are learned. In operant conditioning, we associate behavior with their consequences. In operant conditioning, we learn if I do this action, what is the consequence. Accordingly, according to the nature of consequence, this behavior is promoted or it is stopped. So, we will talk about that in the next lecture. So, there are these are two important types of associative learning. One is called classical conditioning, one is called operant conditioning. This lecture will devote on classical conditioning and next lecture will devote on operant conditioning. Now, sometimes learning can happen in a non-associative context also. There we are not learning to associate between two things, we are only learning that involves change in the magnitude of response to a single stimulus. There is a single stimulus, there are not two things, but our response to that stimulus changes, either it increases or decreases. So, there is no association here, but it is a single stimulus, but your response to that stimulus changes with the passage of time. So, those kind of changes that happens that we learn is called non-associative learning. So, there are two types of non-associative learning, one is called habituation, another is called sensitization. So, let us see what are these two. So, I am discussing this because I will not go as a separate lecture on this, because this is a very basic form of learning. So, just I will introduce that and I will talk about the other forms of learning in more detail. So, habituation and sensitization are two types of non-associative learning. So, what happens in habituation? It is about decreased response to a repeated harmless stimuli. So, whenever there is a same stimuli coming is continuously present in the background or in the environment, and if it is relatively harmless, it is not doing any harm to you, our response to those stimuli decreases, we stop paying attention to them. So, these are called habituation. For example, ignoring the sound of a fan after hearing it continuously. So, let us say there is a sound of fan or an AC which is going on and on continuously. So, whenever you initially come to the room, you may notice and pay some attention. After some time, after 5 minutes, you may not even notice it. So, your response to that stimuli decreased. So, that is called habituation, simply because it is no longer important for you, it is no longer dangerous and so on. So, you stop paying attention to that. Same stimulus, but your response initially when you came in the room and after 5 minutes the response changed, decreased. So, this is called habituation. This is a kind of adaptation that happens to the stimuli which is no longer needed to give attention. You do not need to give attention to it continuously, because if you keep paying attention to the sound of fan, you will not be able to do other kind of work, other important thing that you need to do. So, automatically you stop paying attention, or your attention decreases or your response to that decreases simply. So, these are all examples of habituation. Sensitization is opposite to this. What is sensitization? Your increased response to a strong or repeated stimuli. Sometimes certain stimuli can be very strong and may have some danger associated with it, then our response actually increases with time rather than decreases as it happens in habituation. It happens opposite in this case. Our response actually becomes stronger with the passage of time to a single stimuli. For example, becoming more sensitive to noise after hearing a loud explosion. Sometimes whenever there is a loud explosion, we become more sensitive and we pay a little bit of attention of any sound. For example, following an earthquake, for example, people experience exaggerated response to movement, light or noise. Let us say earthquake, some jolt and movement happens. After that, a slight change somewhere, some slight sound, some slight movement, people become highly sensitive to it. So, the same stimuli, but the response to the stimuli actually increases after some time, simply because now this is important stimuli, this could be dangerous stimuli, you have to pay attention. So, this is just opposite to habituation. In habituation, your response decreases, in sensitization here response increases. So, it depends on the nature of stimuli. Sometimes it can sensitization can happen, sometimes habituation can happen. So, these are non-associative. You are not learning association between two things. It is the same stimuli, but your response either increases or decreases. Now, why we show sometimes habituation and sometimes sensitization? Under what is the requirement for this? What is the condition, precondition for this? When habituation happens and when sensitization happens? So, in general, habituation occurs in response to milder stimuli and sensitization occurs in response to stronger stimuli. So, in general, as a general law, whenever stimuli is mild and harmless, we generally get habituated to it, we stop paying attention to it. But when a stimuli is very strong and possibly there are some dangers associated with it, we become more sensitized towards it, or sensitivity increases or sensitization occurs. So, habituation ensures that we do not waste precious resources in monitoring low priority stimuli. These are all adaptation process. When something is not dangerous and it is low stimuli, we should not waste our energy on something which does not require there is no need for attention. Okay? So, we do not pay attention. On the other hand, sensitization is useful in dangerous situations, particularly when stimuli is very strong and possibly dangerous. Then we have to pay attention, because it is now the question of your survival and so on. So, after detecting one harmful stimulus, raising our overall level of responsiveness should improve reaction time should other danger arise. So, if there is a harmful stimulus, our responsiveness should increase. That is what will lead us to adapt to situation. That will help us to survive in that situation. If you decrease our response, then if something is dangerous, you may be in danger or you may be killed also. So, responsiveness should increase. So, these are all adaptive functions. So, these are some of the examples of non-associative learning. So, the third category of learning, which humans beings particularly learn a lot of things that we acquire in our life is through observational learning. What is observational learning? It is also called as social learning, also called modeling. It occurs when an organism learns by watching the actions of another organism. We simply learn by looking at other people, other situations or situations in the environment. Simply I see somebody is doing something and I learn it by looking at them. Okay? So, those are called observational learning. For example, a child learns manners by watching parents, a student imitates teachers' behavior, learning skill by watching videos and so on. So, you are just observing others and you are learning things. So, these are called observational learning, and it is very specific, more important in the human context. Now, this learning we will talk about more in the lecture number 10. So, the same module, the last lecture will be devoted to observational learning. So, today's lecture will be specifically focusing on classical conditioning, which is a type of associative learning. So, we learn by association. So, Ivan Pavlov, who was a Russian physiologist, he was the most important figure in terms of doing research and understanding its concepts and so on. He contributed a lot in understanding classical conditioning. So, let us look into this. So, Pavlov's theory of classical conditioning, because he was the one who developed this whole theory and did the basic foundational research. So, we call it classical conditioning. It is a classical research that happened, and it was done by Pavlov, Ivan Pavlov, who was a Russian physiologist. So, although learning theory primarily developed in the United States, it was significantly influenced by Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov. A lot of other research happened in the US, but this particular concept developed in Russia by Ivan Pavlov. In the early 20th century, Pavlov studied the digestive systems of humans and other animals like dogs and observed the salivary responses of dogs. So, he was doing some research which are not directly related to learning. He was a physiologist and he was doing research in the context of digestive system of humans, and he was doing some research with the animals, particularly dogs. and their salivary response to food and so on. So, basically he was doing some physiological research. He noticed that dogs would automatically salivate when given food. So, whenever food comes near to a dog, the saliva would appear in their mouth. This is a natural response. Okay? This is what he observed. This is a natural occurring response. It will happen to any dog. You give them food, saliva will come. It can happen to humans also, but not dog. He was doing research with the dogs, and it's a very natural response, automatic response, which he termed as unconditioned response. We will talk about that, we will try to understand. So, he called them unconditioned response, means there is no condition, automatically it will happen. So, you give food to a dog, saliva will come to their mouth, okay? And it will kind of spill out of the mouth and so on. So, he called it as an unconditioned response, triggered by the unconditioned stimulus. Stimulus is what? Food. It is a food that automatically creates a or stimulates a response. So, whenever food comes, it is an unconditioned stimulus. What is the response? Response is unconditioned response, that is the saliva. So, he was just observing some of this phenomena that is happening with the dog. Pavlov discovered what he found kind of accidentally, that if a neutral stimulus means it will not stimulate any response, particular response from the dog or whatever animals, such as a light or a bell. If it is preceded the food, the dogs would eventually salivate in response to the light or bell alone, which is called as conditioned response. Now, what happens? So, I will talk about this using some figures and steps and so on. So, what he found, whenever some neutral stimuli are associated with the unconditioned stimuli like food, or if neutral stimulus means if let us say light or bell, sound of a bell. Now, if you switch on a light or produce a sound of a bell, now dog will not respond in any particular way if it is milder form of sound and so on. So, dog will not respond because it does not create any particular response in terms of dog's behavior. So, that is why he called it as a neutral stimulus. Now, let us say if this neutral stimulus is associated with the unconditioned stimulus, which is food. So, sound of a bell, then food comes, with the food automatically the saliva will come to the mouth. Let us say they are associated. A neutral stimuli is now associated with an unconditioned stimuli. So, he found when it is paired again and again, after some time the neutral stimuli start producing, or it kind of simulated the response of an unconditioned stimuli. Like when food is given, saliva comes. Now, after pairing of this, after sometimes when only light or sound is produced, saliva would come, which was not there earlier the case. It happened because of association. So, dog learned a new response. So, this new response is called conditioned response. So, this process is called classical conditioning. So, we will look little bit more detail about that. So, this process where a neutral stimulus becomes associated with an unconditioned stimulus to elicit conditioned response is known as a classical conditioning. So, this whole process of associating a neutral stimuli with a unconditioned stimuli, which then leads to ultimately a conditioned response, this whole process is called classical conditioning. The Pavlov's extensive research in this area laid the foundation for this whole classical conditioning, and it is a very important concept in the process of learning or a theory of learning. So, let us look into this whole process of classical conditioning in more detail. Now, let us say this is what are the steps involved in it. So, first step, natural response before conditioning happens. So, the same example of dog, food is presented. Now, this what is the stimulus? Food is presented to the dog. So, food is unconditioned stimulus because what is the response of when food is presented? Dog salivates. So, उसका मुंह में पानी आता है means the dog will start salivating. ठीक है? Food is presented, saliva will come, will be produced in the mouth of the dog. ठीक है? So, these are natural response. There is no conditioning here, automatic response. So, stimulus is, in this case, stimulus food is called unconditioned stimulus. The natural response salivation is called unconditioned response. So, there is no conditioning, these are automatic response. Okay? So, before conditioning what is happening. Okay? Now, before before conditioning happens, let us say light is a neutral stimulus. You switch on the light, response, no response from the dog. Dog has no particular response patterns in terms of when you switch on light and so on. Okay. So, this light will be a neutral stimulus, means it is not creating any response. So, it is neutral stimulus. Okay. So, these are like what is present before the conditioning happens. Now, second step is conditioning procedure. What happens? Now, this association is happening. So, light is switched on, what is the stimulus? And food is presented to the dog. Now, two things are associated here, light plus food. Light switched on, after that food came automatically. This came in sequence of time. So, light is neutral stimulus plus food is unconditioned stimulus. Both are presented together one after the other. Okay. What is the response? Dog salivates because food is there. Now, dog is salivating not because of light here, but because of the food itself. Because light and then food come, then after food the saliva is coming. Okay. Saliva is responding. Now, this response is again unconditioned response because it is coming from the food itself. Third step, when this step is paired again and again, light, food, saliva, light, food, saliva, light, food, saliva, it is paired again and again for many trials. What happens after that? The light alone is presented to the dog starts salivating. Now, just if you switch on the light without giving food, the dog starts salivating. Now, this is a new response. Dog was not salivating initially when light was switched on, but when it was paired with the food again and again, just switching on the light, the dog starts salivating. This is a new response dog has learned by associating with other stimuli. So, this is called as a conditioned stimulus, and this saliva which is coming from the light itself is called conditioned response. So, what is happening here? What kind of learning is happening? A new learning has happened. Dog generally never produce saliva when light is switched on, but here because of associating two things, light with the food, the dog learned a new response that if light is switched on means food will come. It automatically start responding to that that stimulus, neutral stimulus, and it starts salivating. Okay. So, dog has learned a new thing in life. So, by association. So, this is called classical conditioning. So, if you see the picture here, the first food is presented, the dog is salivating. Second step, sound, let us say sound or light, whatever it is, these are all neutral stimuli. It can be sound also, it can be light also. Dog is not salivating. These are natural concept. What is the third step? Food plus sound, both are coming together. So, saliva is coming because food is there. This saliva is coming because food is there. Now, this is repeated again and again. After some repetition, when sound is produced, saliva is coming. Now, this is a conditioned response, conditioned stimuli. So, this becomes conditioned, means it is a new response. This is conditioned stimuli and this is conditioned response. So, this is the whole process of classical conditioning, the initial experiment that Pavlov did. Similarly, lot of things we learn in our life by associating. So, this is just initial experiment that showed that how animals including human beings also can learn things by associating. Now, what is the examples of classical conditioning in human life? So, this was animal example. What are the proof that such kind of learning happens in humans also? Let us say, let us take the examples of fear response. Lot of fear response, lot of fear that we develop in our life are actually through classical conditioning. For example, a person who has experienced traumatic events such as being in a car accident might develop fear response when hearing the sound of screeching tires. Many times, few stimuli get associated with fear because of certain incidents. For example, if somebody experiences car accident, the car accident is a very traumatic accident and the person develops lot of fear around it, and let us say the person survives. Now, many times such people develop lot of fear associated with whatever were present during the accident. because that accident becomes associated with those stimuli around that accident scenario. One thing could be, let us say, screeching sound of the tire. When accident happens, let us say the sound of that screeching sound of the tire was present. It was a neutral thing before the accident. Now, after the accident, this whole accident and fear of the accident got associated with the sound of the screeching sound of the tire. The moment after that, the moment anytime whenever the person hears the sound of screeching tire, all the fears comes up of the accident related fear. So, this is a new response. Earlier screeching tire was not creating any response, but after the accident the person learns a new response, that any sound related to tire screeching, it stimulates all the fears of the accident. The person become highly fearful. So, this is a new response which was not there earlier. The person learned to fear to something neutral, which is a neutral sound with certain responses. So, this is called conditioned response. The person learned a new response, conditioned response. Many people, they start fearing driving also. After the accident, they cannot simply drive because of all the fears. The moment they go in the behind that steering, all the fears comes up. So, earlier the car was a very neutral thing. Now, car has become associated with fear because of the accident. So, sometimes some kind of experiences get associated with other neutral things that were present at that time. So, this is an examples of fear response that a lot of people learn simply because of certain experience gets associated with them. So, this is an example of classical conditioning in human life. Another example is called taste aversion. Someone who gets food poisoning after eating something, let us say any kind of food, it could be let us say Maggi, sushi, whatever it is. Okay. So, let us say someone likes sushi or likes let us say Maggi, whatever it is, any kind of food, okay, and they generally like that food. So, the food was not a problem at all, but let us say after eating that food in one particular day, they got poisoning because of some other reasons, maybe not because of the food itself or whatever reason, the way it was served and whatever it is. The person developed some kind of nausea, vomiting because of the poisoning after eating that food. Now, that food was normal and the person is to like that food and eat generally, but because in that particular day that food got associated with vomiting tendency and nausea because of poisoning or whatever it is. After that incident, the people generally develop kind of aversion or hatred towards that particular food. This happens very commonly. If a food get associated with nausea or vomiting kind of tendency, after that people generally do not like that food, because the moment they see that food, that all nausea experience gets stimulated. They feel like again vomiting, those kind of tendencies comes up. Now this food is not a problem after that, because this was just in one incident. After that the food, whatever sushi or Maggi that you are eating, is a very normal food, okay? But still you will not be able to eat it, or you may not like to eat it simply because of that association in one day of vomiting with that food. The next moment whenever you try to eat that whole things get stimulated and the people develop certain kind of taste aversion. So, again this is a new response. Food was very neutral thing before that particular food. Now, because it got associated with some negative experience, now you are no longer able to eat that food. So, that is another example of classical conditioning. Okay? So, this whole negative experience got associated with that food, although that food might not have nothing to do with that particular experience after that. So, this can happen. Now, let us see some of the other key processes involved in the classical conditioning. Now, in the classical conditioning there can be something called as generalization. What is generalization? It occurs when a conditioned response, whatever that new learned response, is elicited by a stimuli that are similar to the conditioned stimulus, even if those stimulus were never paired with the unconditioned stimulus. So, sometimes generalization can happen in the learning process of classical conditioning. For example, the dog learned, for example, if a dog is conditioned to salivate on the sound of a bell, whatever example that I get, let us say sound of the bell, the dog learned to salivate. So, this is a conditioned response to a conditioned stimulus. It might also salivate to similar sounds, not exact sound, but similar sounds which sound very similar to the sound like chime or a different type of bell. even if those were not present during the association. So, the dog has learned to generalize it to other similar sound. So, that generalization can also happen many times when the dogs simply are not able to discriminate what particular sound was present. So, it can respond to any other similar sounds. So, that is called generalization. So, sometimes whenever we learn to fear one thing, so you learn to fear, let us say, some white object. So, a particular white object, let us say you learn to fear a white rabbit for example, then any other white similar kind of fluffy object you may become fearful, because now you are not able to discriminate, generalizing it to all the other similar objects. So, this is an example of generalization. Sometimes conditioning can be generalized to similar objects. Then discrimination is just opposite to that sometimes you learn to discriminate and you are exactly conditioned to particular kind of stimuli, not any other similar stimuli. So, that is called discrimination. So, discrimination is the ability to differentiate between the conditioned stimuli and other stimuli that have been paired with the unconditioned stimuli. So, you just very specific, you are only able to discriminate between similar objects. So, you are responding to only those stimuli which were present during the conditioning. For example, if a dog is conditioned to salivate to the sound of specific bell, it learns to salivate only to that specific bell and not to other similar sound, then it will be called as discrimination. Okay. So, sometimes generalization can happen, sometimes discrimination can happen depending on the whatever animals, its tendencies and the situations and so on. So, both phenomena can happen. Then there is something called as an extinction. Whatever that is a new learned response can also become extinct. It is not that the dog will learn this response for the rest of the life, not necessarily. So, extinction means the extinction occurs when the conditioned stimuli is repeatedly presented without the unconditioned stimulus. Then slowly the response becomes weaker and weaker. For example, if the sound of the bell is repeatedly presented to the dog without following it food. Now, after certain pairings, obviously, when immediately you produce the sound or the light, the dog starts salivating. Let us say, but you are giving it sound again and again without food for many times, the dog will learn that no longer this sound is going to produce me food. So, it will stop salivating. So, that newly learned response now got extincted. So, this is the process called extinction. Then sometimes spontaneous recovery can happen after extinction. That extinction has happened, now after certain time interval it can automatically come up again. So, this is called spontaneous recovery. So, spontaneous recovery is the appearance of a previously extinguished conditioned response after a period of rest and no further conditioning. No further conditioning was not done, but after certain rest it can come up again. For example, after the conditioned response, salivation to the bell has been extinguished. Now, because no longer food was presented, the dog forgot about it. If some time passes and the bell is presented again, the dog may start salivating again, even if the food is still not presented. So, spontaneously sometimes that memory comes up again, okay? But it may not stay, but it can come sometimes. So, that is called spontaneous recovery. Pavlov demonstrated that conditioned response could generalize to similar stimuli. Sometimes dog could generalize and produce saliva to sounds or the lights similar to the original presented. Pavlov also showed limits of generalization. It is not that any similar kind of stimuli will be generalized. Dogs learn to discriminate also between sounds associated with the food and those that were not. This discrimination means they would only salivate to specific sound. So, Pavlov found some cases generalization also happened, in some cases discrimination also happens. Pavlov also demonstrated that this conditioning could also be reversed. If the conditioned stimuli like light is repeatedly presented without the unconditioned stimuli, the conditioned response diminishes and it can be. So, extinction was also present. So, all this concept that we discussed, actually in the original experiment the dog showed all these processes: discrimination, generalization, extinction, spontaneous recovery and so on. Now, classical conditioning is not that you can teach anybody to learn anything and associate anything with the anything. So, there is nothing like this. So, there are limitations to that also. Modern research indicates that classical conditioning is not straightforward as initially Pavlov demonstrated that you can associate anything with anything and people and the animal or the people will get conditioned to that. It is not as straightforward as it was conceptualized initially. While Pavlov believed that conditioning principles were general rule applicable to all animals, it is now understood that the different organisms are more easily conditioned to responses in a particular ways to specific stimuli. Now, it is understood that specific stimuli may be more easily conditioned to a specific animal or specific humans because of their certain tendencies. All the stimuli cannot be equally conditioned. For instance, hungry dogs can be conditioned to salivate with the bell that is paired with the sight of smell and meat. So, if a dog is hungry, then conditioning with the food with other stimuli is much more easier, because the dog has certain condition present within that it will be easily connecting things, simply because the dog is hungry. So, food will have more stronger impact on it. So, if you associate a hungry dog with some in place of food with something else, probably it will not be of that effective. So, there are certain limitations. What animals has condition within itself, what is its preferences, accordingly the conditioning can be easier and difficult. So, each species and even each individual within the species has certain tendencies that either facilitate or impede certain type of learning. So, we all have certain tendencies. If the conditioning is in line with their tendencies, the conditioning can happen much faster. If it is not aligned with our preferences, then obviously it is much more difficult to condition them. For example, humans tend to rely more on visual cues than smells, and different people have varied perceptual and aesthetic inclinations. What kind of stimuli will have impact on you? For example, visual stimuli will have more impact. So, like this, every species, and also there will be differences within the species, what is their preferences, what they like. So, if something is conditioned according to their liking, the conditioning is more likely to happen. Despite all these complexities, classical conditioning still remains one of the most dominant, potent learning theory that has been found to be applicable in animals and humans, and there are certain applications to it also. We will look into that also. Particularly in all this classical conditioning, what is happening here? Mostly the automatic response, the pairing of stimulus and automatic response is there. So, in classical conditioning, typically there is an automatic response that is associated with something else. So, a lot of these emotions that human being experience, these are automatic to certain stimuli. So, a lot of this classical conditioning happens in emotional context. Now, John B. Watson, who is also considered as a father of behaviorism. Now, behaviorism as a school of thought, I think we have discussed something about that earlier also. He elaborated on the Pavlov works, and he kind of did some research in the human context. He is this whole concept of behaviorism school of thought, he was considered as a father of behaviorism. So, John Watson, he was an American psychologist who greatly influenced by Pavlov's work and applied that in his own research, particularly in the United States. So, Watson advocated for a shift in American psychology towards becoming true science and doing true experiments in the field of psychology and so on. Watson did a lot of things, particularly he focused on observable behavior, scientific research, which were the hallmarks of behaviorism. Watson kind of created this whole school of behaviorism. His career ended in 1920 when he left academics for business. His work along with the popularization of Pavlov research paved way for further development in behaviorism and so on. So, although he did not stayed in the academic for a long time, but he had a very strong impact. One of the things that he did was similar conditioning, classical conditioning that we did, what Pavlov did with the animals, he did it with the humans, particularly with a child. So, that is called as a little Albert experiment. Watson is known for this experiment. Is a similar classical conditioning experiment, but it is not with the dogs, but it is with a human child whose name is Albert. So, he did this research with his graduate student Rosalie Reiner in 1920. In this experiment, an 11-month-old child named Albert was conditioned to fear a white rat. So, they kind of created fear in that child, which are some ethical problems. We may not be able to do such experiment now because it is not right to create fear in the child. So, but what they did is that they created or conditioned certain fear within that child, particularly the fear for white rat. The child was not at all afraid of white rat earlier, but they conditioned fear to this object. How they did this? Initially, Albert showed no fear to the white rat, which was a neutral stimulus for Albert. However, Watson and Rainer paired the presentation of this rat with a loud frightening noise, which is an unconditioned stimulus, because loud sound will create fear response in a child. So, they associated this loud sound with the rat, presentation of rat to the child again and again, which naturally caused Albert to cry, which is an unconditioned response, crying to a loud sound. What they associated a neutral stimulus, white rat, which Albert was not afraid, with a unconditioned stimuli, that is very loud sound, and because of this association the child started crying and so on. So, after some times when this whole fear got associated with the white rat. So, Albert was not at all afraid of white rat earlier, but now because of this association with the loud sound, the Albert started becoming afraid of white rat and started crying whenever he used to see that white rat. So, this is a new learned response through classical conditioning. So, after such several pairing, Albert began to cry at the sight of white rat, demonstrating fear could be conditioned in humans also. So, this experiment also showed generalization as Albert began to show fear responses to other white furry objects. So, this is an example of generalization. The Albert was not only afraid of white rat, but any similar object or furry objects like dolls and so on, the child started becoming afraid of that. So, it generalized to other objects. So, like this, initially the child was not afraid of white rat, then after that the child started becoming afraid of that. So, this is one of the typical classical conditioning experiment that he did, Watson did in the human context. Now, what are the applications of classical conditioning in the real world? One of the most important application, and still these are very important applications that are still prevalent in today's world, today's field of therapy and so on, is called as behavior therapy. So, in behavior therapy, lot of these classical conditioning principles are used. What is those principles? For many psychologists, classical conditionings of emotions reaction is crucial for understanding development of psychopathology. If you look at lot of the psychological disorders, one of the major reasons behind these disorders are emotional problems, exaggerated fears, anxiety and so on, that creates lot of this psychological disorder. A lot of these emotions are classically conditioned. So, they can be unconditioned using classical condition principles. So, behavior therapy based on classical conditioning focuses on extinguishing problematic response, such as conditioned fears, conditioning new more desirable response to stimuli that elicit unwanted anxieties. So, if a person develops anxiety towards some object, certain stimuli, then using the same principle we can counter condition it, remove those fears from the object using these principles. So, that is called behavior therapy. Mary Cover Jones conducted one of such systematic behavior therapy aiming to remove fear response in a boy named Peter, who was 2 years and 10 months old. So, one such experiment was done. So, what did another boy his name was another child, his name was Peter. So, Mary Cover Jones did opposite to what Watson did. Watson created fear in that little Albert child and proved that conditioning can happen to humans also. Mary Cover Jones did opposite. There was a boy named Peter who was afraid of white rat, and she tried to remove those fears using the principles of behavior or classical conditioning. What did so Peter, who was a subject in this experiment, generally healthy, well adjusted child, had an exaggerated fear of white rat already, which extended to other white furry objects similar to rabbits. So, here the case was opposite. In the case of little Albert, it was conditioned. Now, in case of Peter, he already had this fear automatically. So, this boy has an exaggerated fear of white rat and similar furry object, just like little Albert, which was created. Now, in this case, it was naturally present. This fear was similar to the fear response of little Albert, which was created. Jones meticulously documented Peter's fear response and the conditions that elicited this fear. Jones tried to meticulously understand how fear is created and what are the intensities, when it is become more strong, and all this recorded. So, she then aimed to uncondition, since if fear can be created using classical conditioning, so using counter conditioning it can be uncreated or removed also. So, that is the principle of uncondition. Peter's fear response to the rabbit and observe this unconditioning would generalize to other stimuli or not. So, that was what she was trying to do. So, Jones bought Peter to play. How did she did? She bought Peter to play with rabbit was presented alongside other children who were not afraid of the rabbit. So, there was a group of children and all the other children were not afraid of rabbit. So, they were playing with the rabbit. So, Peter was put in that group of children to play with the rabbit. Gradually, so systematically, slowly the Peter was introduced to white rabbit in a very comfortable safe environment. Slowly what happens? Gradually Peter's fear diminished and he moved from almost complete terror at the sight of rabbit to a complete positive response. Obviously, she did it step by step, slowly sight of the rabbit, then slowly the rabbit was put close to it. So, the Peter was being counter conditioned. If you are afraid of something, if you start facing it slowly step by step, that whole fear conditioning can become unconditioned. So, that was what she did, and she found that Peter slowly this whole fear response was actually diminished. So, she found after successfully unconditioning Peter's fear rabbit, he also lost fear for other far objects, feathers, cotton wool and so on. This is called also generalization of unconditioned response, that was also present. So, this marked a significant early use of how classical conditioning principles can be used to treat fears and so on. So, that was one of the early evidence. Systematic desensitization is one of the most structured therapy that was developed out of classical conditioning and it is still used. Systematic desensitization is a significant advancement in applying classical conditioning to psychopathology, particularly a lot of these fear related symptoms by something called as a desensitization process. It was developed by African psychiatrist Joseph Wolf, who was influenced by Pavlov's work. So, Wolf considered persistent anxiety reactions as learned response that could be unlearned through therapy. So, a lot of this anxiety, particularly anxiety response that a lot of people have, exaggerated anxiety response, Wolf said this is a learned response through classical conditioning. We learned and associate things with so many fearful objects and so on. So, this can be unlearned using the same principle, counter conditioning. So, systematic desensitizations, Wolf's therapeutic technique aims to inhibit anxiety through counter conditioning. So, the aim is to particularly anxiety related issues using counter conditioning, the anxiety response is slowly decreased and then finally removed from the people who experience them. How it is done? So, it is called the principle of counter conditioning. So, if fear is learned through conditioning, can we counter condition it so that it is now removed? So, in counter conditioning, an individual learns a new response that is physiologically incompatible with the existing anxiety response. So, to remove anxiety, we need to find another stimuli or another stimuli which is incompatible to anxiety. So, that both cannot stay together. For example, one incompatible stimuli for fear or anxiety is relaxation. So, you cannot be relaxed and be full of anxiety, both cannot happen together. These are incompatible responses. Whenever you are stressed, that means you are not relaxed. Whenever you are relaxed, that means you are not stressed or you are not full of anxiety. Both cannot happen. So, if there can be relaxation, if you experience relaxation, you are not full of anxiety. Both cannot happen together in the same time, because both are opposite to each other. Incompatible response means this. So, in systematic desensitization, this is what is done. They introduce something opposite to the emotional response, which is in physiologically opposite kind of response, and they try to replace anxiety with that opposite, because if that is placed, the other one automatically vanishes. So, the goal is for the person to learn a new response such as relaxation to the previously feared stimuli. Whenever you are afraid of something, you remove that fear with a relaxation slowly. So, that means whenever there is a possibility of fear, you tend to experience relaxation. So, if you experience relaxation, fear will automatically vanish. So, that is what is done. So, that is how association is done with a new response rather than fear. which was already there. So, through new classical conditioning experiences, the individual is taught to experience relaxation instead of fear when exposed to a stimuli. So, whenever a lot of people, let us say, fear of certain objects, whenever they see that object, fear arises. Now, this person is learned to experience relaxation whenever the stimuli comes up. So, fear is slowly replaced by relaxation. So, it takes time. So, and it is done very systematically. Initially, very low stimuli situations are given to them, so that they are not overwhelmed. Then slowly the intensity of the fear is increased by producing more and more of that stimuli, and they learn to feel relaxed in that context. So, this is done very systematically, step by step, and that anxiety hierarchies are created from lowest to highest, and then each hierarchy created either mentally they have to visualize or actually they are presented, and they learn in all the hierarchy of the anxiety situations. Whenever they face them and learn to experience relaxation. So, slowly this fear diminishes. So, this is the broad principles. So, there are many things involved in it. These are some of the examples of how classical conditioning can be applied in real life context. There is one, some of the recent research also shows that lot of this unconscious development of fears and lot of attitudes that we have, certain biasness towards some ideas, some people, some situations, a lot of these things can be actually classically conditioned. We learn them by classical conditioning. So, research have demonstrated that classical conditioning can be used to show how people unconsciously develop fears and attitude towards others. How do you perceive others, how do you judge others? A lot of this can be certainly we learn them by classical conditioning. Studies by certain researcher like Krosnick and others have shown that subliminal presentation of stimuli with positive or negative affective value can influence attitude towards other stimuli. So, even if subliminally certain stimuli are presented, we have discussed subliminal perception in the earlier model. So, these are like stimuli when presented below the threshold. The person is not even aware that something is presented very fast. So, these are called subliminal presentation of stimuli with positive or negative affective value can influence their attitudes later on, even though they do not know they are exposed to that. For example, if a photo is subliminally presented with a negative emotion, people will unconsciously develop dislike for that photo. So, if there is a photo is presented and it is associated with certain negative stimuli or negative emotion, anything that creates negative emotion, and then this photo comes up. Even though person who are not aware that this some negative emotional stimuli were presented, they may not because it is subliminally present. When people are asked to rate those photos, they rated them negatively, even though they are not conscious of it. So, some kind of association happened in a classical conditioning format, and vice versa for positive, they develop positive attitude towards the photo. So, in a very subconscious, unconscious way, we can learn lot of attitudes in a classical conditioning way that can influence our attitudes and behaviors and so on, and also learn lot of fears and so on. So, it has a lot of implications for our prejudices and the stereotypes that we develop in our life. So, this line of research suggests that many of our attitudes and preferences may be classically conditioned in a unconscious manner. Social psychologists like Cassioppo concluded that aversive prejudices once created may be difficult to consciously eliminate. People can have egalitarian beliefs, but still display prejudicial behavior in certain situations due to conditioned aversive response that learned in childhood. So, during childhood we learn lot of these things classically conditioned with certain emotions, and even though you may have all these great ideas and neutral value, but still in behavior people are biased. One of the reason is this classical conditioning. They have connect certain emotional things with certain judgments and attitudes that they have. So, people may, when they speak to them, they may have no biasness towards this, but in behavior you may show the people are actually still biased. So, it may be very deep rooted. So, this implies that non-prejudicial attitude can coexist, that you may show that I do not have any biasness towards it, but it can still be coexist with conditioned negative reactions. You may react very negatively, explaining why people may be prejudiced despite sincerely held egalitarian views and so on. So, what people say and what people do, there may be differences because of this reason. One of the reason is that classically they have so much of emotional reaction to certain things, but when you ask them in terms of attitude, they may show they do not have any kinds of negative attitudes or positive attitudes, but in behavior you may see that kind of things. So, this can be very unconsciously acquired using classical conditions. So, these are some of the things about classical conditioning. So, this is one of the major theories of learning which comes under associative learning. So, with this I stop here. Thank you.